practiced historically and how it's still practiced today. So it's not going to be super ancient, but I did want to start with this shoe, which you might know was the oldest ever shoe that was discovered in the Armenian caves in Armenia. And this was hand-stitched, so it's probably not embroidery how we think of it today, but it shows that Armenians have been working with their hands and with needles for centuries and even millennia. And a little, one of them's something's missing, but that's okay. I wanted to talk about how normally we think of embroidery as a women's craft, but actually historically a lot of Armenian embroidery was done by men. So I wanted to start with church embroidery because this would have been done by men like hundreds of years ago. And there were guilds in Istanbul and in modern Armenia where this was practiced. This example here is from the Victorian Albert Museum collection, so if you want to visit it yourself, you can email them or book an appointment to see it at the V&A East. So I've tried to include examples that are in London, so if people want to see it themselves, they can. But you'll see that they use like a lot of precious metals and church embroidery. And this is another example here in London. So this is in the collection of Sobsarki's Church in Kensington. They don't use it so much during service today, but if you ask to look at it, they will show you, just like they showed me. And this is an example of how they use like the most precious metals and pearls and silver and threads, and these would have all been made by men or monks hundreds of years ago. And I wanted to include this example. So this man who made it, Gasparian, only passed away a few years ago. So it shows that even today, there are still men creating these really richly embroidered pieces of vestments for the Armenian church. And I believe that this was made in New York, actually. So it's not just in Armenia, in the diaspora we're creating things like this. But besides men making embroidery, traditionally women would have made embroidery for their ojit or dowry. And there is actually a saying amongst Aintab Armenians historically that once the girl is in the cradle, the trousseau is in the box. So as soon as a girl was born, they would have started creating things for the next stage of their life, so for their marriage, so they'll have like homeware and baptismal clothes and everything straight from the moment that a daughter was born. Unfortunately, Armenian embroidery took a different meaning after the genocide. A lot of girls ended up in orphanages and families were very poor. And a lot of missionaries who came to help during this time saw that these girls were skilled with using needle and thread. It was very cheap to produce, so they would make schools and teach girls different styles of embroidery and create objects to be sold in the West. And actually in places like London it was very popular. So even at Liberties they sold a lot of Armenian embroidery and they had whole schools like this. So it is a kind of sad way that Armenian embroidery was preserved. But it was a way of creating an income for young girls and their families during this time. And actually today, like when the Syrian Armenians came to Armenia after the war, a lot of them had really good skills in Western Armenian embroidery, and a lot of these women created businesses to support themselves, even to this day. So the same thing is kind of happening again 100 years later. And this is just an advert in American magazines, like telling people like why they should support Armenians and buy embroidery from Armenia. So this was being advertised in the US, which is probably not how it's advertised now. And also even like in some of the genocide memorials, there have been references to Armenian embroidery. So this is a woman creating janyat or needle lace in this monument in the US. And I also wanted to show this. So this is a sample book of a young girl who left Western Armenia like around the time that the genocide was starting. Her name was Catherine, and she moved to Cairo. And when she was in Cairo, she had this sample book of different kinds of needle lace, and she got a lot of customers, and she became very popular. And because of this, somehow some of her patrons helped her move to the US. So her skill in embroidery helped her get safety in America. And I'm going to talk now about some of the different styles of Armenian embroidery. And most of the main different types are named after the cities and villages where they came from. So it's just a map to show you. I mean, I'm sure people here already know how big Armenia has been and where Armenians have lived, but how diverse and spread out all these different towns and villages are. So I'm going to start with Marash embroidery. These two examples are both also in the V&A collection if you want to see them. It's also the kind of embroidery on my dress. There's actually two kinds of Marash embroidery, but this is the most famous. It's sometimes called Husbad's guard or Kartna guard or secret sewing, because on the reverse side, so you can see on the bottom side, you can't really tell how it was made. So it's a secret, someone has to teach you how to do it. And the picture on the left, you can't really see it so well, shows you a little bit of how it's drawn before you do it. So with Marash embroidery, it's not a counted embroidery, the design would be drawn on the fabric, and then people would stitch on top of it. And often it was done on cotton, because historically they cultivated a lot of cotton in Marash. And historically, they actually had a separate lady to draw the design, and then the embroiderer would embroider on top of it. And historically, they would do it, they would dip a pen in indigo to draw the pattern. And if it was dark fabric, they would make a solution out of starch and water so that the drawing would be white to stitch on top of. And these are just some of the designs that are in Marash embroidery. You'll see that the words kind of look Turkish. That's because this is Ottoman times and most Armenians would have spoken Turkish and Armenian. So the one on the left is the cup, in the middle is the watch, and I believe the one on the right is the almonds. And I just wanted to include this extract from a book which said that on Marash embroidery that it was very popular in London during the genocide. So British people were helping Armenians by buying this embroidery. And this picture is to illustrate how Marash embroidery is done. So it's done in two stages. You create a grid. I've done it in two colors. So, and then you weave the pattern in between the grid to create this big full shape. And then you'll notice that it kind of looks like crosses. And some people think that because it looks like crosses, that's why Turks and Kurds who also lived in Marash didn't actually adopt this kind of embroidery for themselves. Now this is the second kind of Marash embroidery. It's known as Hartagar, and it looks almost completely different, but it was very popular in the region as well. And it's more of a flat stitch, sometimes called the Zaytun stitch. It often had birds and tulips in it. And this is an example as well. So from the back of the other kind of Marash embroidery, it also has very small stitches from the back.
There's a connection problem.
Next I'm going to talk about needle lace or janyogs. And this would have been done by Armenian girls across Armenia. And it's literally done with just a needle, a finger, and a piece of thread.
You just flip it. Just carry on.
Just move it around.
Enough.
It's made out of knots and loops. Often it was done purely in white, and like most traditionally it's done in a circular motion.
How did you know?
So these are janyags. The one on the left is probably the one that you're most familiar with seeing. And there was this one curator in the US who described janyags like the Armenian diaspora. So if you cut a janyag, it's not going to break. Like there'll be a cut, but it's not going to disintegrate because it's made up of knots. And she said it's like the Armenian diaspora people, like made up of knots and loop stronger together. But if you cut it, it'll never break. So these are a lot of Armenian homes have these. The one on the right is called Karin janyag. They're from Karin or Erzurum, and they're a lot more colorful. They often have flowers and sometimes even like chickens in them. And these would have been put on the headdress that would have been worn with the daras, so the traditional dress from this region. And it was also known as a Vartana. And this is just an example of the janyags in my family. So next, I'm going to talk about Aintab embroidery. And this is quite interesting just because recently UNESCO recognized Aintab embroidery on the Intangible Cultural Heritage list, but they recognized it as being Turkish. So the Armenian origins of it have been erased, but it's important to know that this is Armenian embroidery. It's normally done on white, so it's a cut work embroidery, so you would cut threads, pull them out, and then stitch them back together. And in Armenian, it's known as tel gudral and tel kashel. It's really difficult, but really beautiful. And so when they cut it out, they would tend to create grids to create these different shapes. And when they stitch it back together, these different stitches have their own names and meanings. So the one like on the right, like those are almonds. And at the bottom right, the one on the right is lentils, and the bottom right is almonds. And then this piece here, like coming out of the star, this is a tree of life. And this would often be done on cotton or linen, so any fabric that is woven and has a clear grid to cut and pull out the threads. Next, I'm going to talk about Karin embroidery, which is also Erzurum. And this is a kind of embroidery that would have been done by men. So as well as like church embroidery, this embroidery was also done by men. I think because of the metals and the threads used. And there was actually one man during the 19th century called Melkon Çelikgirian. And he was like so popular, his work was so well known across Europe that he earned medals and prizes like in fairs in Paris. So this embroidery would tend to be done on the daras, or the traditional dress worn by a woman. So this is from an apron, and sometimes they would even put the initials of the wearer on the corners. I believe that this is an almond, so yeah, a blooming almond. And here is another example on the apron and also on the top of the daras, and this top is called kurtkal. Next, I'm going to talk about Urfa embroidery. So Urfa embroidery is probably the only embroidery that's like very obviously representational. Like a lot of Armenian embroidery is very like symbolic, but it's like very graphic or geometric. But if something is a flower in Urfa embroidery, you're going to know it's a flower. So historically, they used a lot of silk and precious metals. Nowadays, embroiderers don't use metal so much, but they often use silk. So this picture kind of shows how it's developed over time. So the one on the right is metal, and this is a historic piece of embroidery. You can see that's very delicate and quite old. The piece in the middle is a contemporary piece of embroidery, and this is all done in silk. The picture on the left isn't actually embroidery, it's a painting, and the story of this painting is really interesting. So there is a series of 232 drawings and 16 paintings that were made by a German man named Bruno Eckhard. During the Armenian genocide, Bruno and his brother went as missionaries to work in Urfa, but Bruno had trained at an art school in Berlin, and he really admired the local embroidery, so he wanted to create pictures to exhibit at an exhibition in Berlin. During the genocide, he married a local girl, but he unfortunately died. Several years later, his widow moved from, I think she ended up in Romania, and she moved to Soviet Armenia, and she donated these drawings to the National Gallery of Armenia, so all of these drawings are in the National Gallery of Armenia collection. Next, I was going to talk about embroidery from Kilis, which is more like applique, so it uses two different colors of fabric, and it's kind of like paper cutting. So you make cuts in the fabric, and then as you sew it, you fold it over and you stitch it on to create these patterns and a different color on top of the other fabric. And these are just a few examples. It's often quite geometric, and they often have birds in it. Next is Silva's embroidery. This is from Sebastia, and it's very colorful. They use 7 different colors of thread and then a darker outline. It's very geometric, and here you can see kind of how it's done. So they do the color first and then do the outline afterwards. So this cross shape in the center is actually a tree of life, and then these are tulips and flowers all around it. And then this is Van embroidery. These pieces are also in the Victoria and Albert Museum collection. Van embroidery, when it's done, it kind of looks like there's holes in the fabric, but it's kind of like a double-layered cross-stitch. Quite hard to explain. This figure of the man isn't that common, but this, which kind of looks like Arabic writing, this bit in the center is actually a labyrinth, and you'll see this a lot in Van embroidery, and they often have this drawn thread work around it. They also had other geometric shapes and these like coffee pots, the inclusion of metal as well, like they did with Urfa embroidery. Sometimes they would mix Urfa and Van stitch together. And then I also wanted to include cross stitch, which obviously isn't like many different cultures use cross stitch, but Armenians also did too, particularly on the aprons that went with the daras. Again, this apron is from the Victoria and Albert Museum collection, and I believe that it's from Sassoon. And here's some pictures of like a woman, how it would have been worn with the daras, and some other examples of the cross-stitch apron. What's quite nice about cross-stitch is we don't have a lot of pictures of people doing Armenian embroidery and like seeing the embroidery in progress, but we do have one picture of these women from a village near Van doing the exact piece of this shirt, which was for a man near Van. And these different patterns also have their own meaning. So the 4 sections in the center, these are the 4 elements, so earth, wind, water, and fire. And then around it, these are actually dragons. So there's a lot of dragons in Armenian culture, and they can be seen as a symbol of protection. And then this is just a modern example. And then I quickly wanted to talk about how in Armenia today people are still preserving Armenian embroidery. So on the left is a picture from a workshop at the ARS in Yerevan, they do workshops on Armenian embroidery almost every week, and they also sell Armenian embroidery to fund their activities. And then at the bottom right is a fashion show that was held by Derion Cultural Center. They create a lot of historic recreations of dollars, so they did a fashion show at the Cascade in the center of Yerevan. And then here I just wanted to show how people are using traditional Armenian embroidery in modern ways, so it's not always mandala. Sometimes people put it on dresses and shirts and other things. And I also wanted to include how there are contemporary Armenian artists using historical, traditional Armenian embroidery in modern ways. So the left is a janyak by an artist called Armenia Toyan, and then in the center this is by Margarita Hazarian, and on the left this is by Ruzanna Hanessian. And yeah, if you want to learn more about Armenian embroidery, I do online courses and have kits where you can learn more, and you can follow me at Armenian Embroidery. But I also have a page of resources of articles and books for anything that you might want to learn more about on my website.